Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel. I never imagined I would be telling this story, but it's been a while since I've been able to forget what happened that night. I hope that by hearing this, you'll help me understand what really happened. I'm not one of those guys who believes in horror stories or anything like that, but after what I've been through, I can assure you that not everything we see or feel can be explained by logic. It all started on a Friday night. I had been working all day, and after an event with friends, I decided to call an Uber to go home. It was late, the city was busy, and the traffic was a little lighter than usual. I was tired, my phone was low on battery, and the last thing I wanted to do was wait for a bus or hail a taxi on the street. The solution was simple: open the app and order a car. The driver was nearby. It didn't take long for the car to appear in front of me, a simple model, not much different from the others. I got in, closed the door, and immediately realized that something wasn't right. She was there, a woman. She was in the back seat, looking out the window, her face turned toward the street without saying a word. I thought she was the driver, but when I looked to the side, I saw a man driving. The first thing I thought was that she was a passenger, but the situation was strange. I don't know exactly what bothered me. Maybe it was the silence or the way she was sitting, but something wasn't right. "Good evening. Are you also going to Zona Sul?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She didn't answer. She didn't even move. The driver apparently didn't care. He was focused on the road, as if that woman were a common presence. The route seemed normal. Traffic was reasonably light for a Friday night, but when I went into the app, I noticed that the woman's location didn't match. She had an address on a street very far from mine. What made me most uncomfortable was realizing that the driver didn't care. I even thought about asking, but the tension in the atmosphere made me hesitate. The trip went smoothly, but with each kilometer I felt more uncomfortable. The woman in the back seat, as if she were invisible, remained motionless, with her eyes fixed on the window. She didn't look at me. She didn't make a sound. Sometimes she glanced in the rearview mirror to observe the driver, but she didn't seem to act like someone normal. She seemed absent, as if she wasn't really there, but at the same time, she was there all the time. Something told me to ask if she was okay, but the idea of breaking the silence made my stomach turn. It didn't feel right. She didn't seem real. I thought about calling my girlfriend, but my cell phone was almost dead. So with nothing else to do, I focused on the road, and that's when I started to notice something even stranger. The driver seemed quieter than usual, but suddenly he took a detour. At first, I thought he had just made a mistake while trying to avoid a traffic jam, but what he did next was worse. He drove down increasingly deserted streets. The city center was behind us, and we were heading toward unfamiliar empty areas. The streetlights became more spaced out, and the environment became strange and oppressive. I asked the driver if he was lost or if he was trying to avoid some traffic. He didn't answer. He didn't look at me. He just drove, expressionless. The woman in the back seat did nothing, as if in a trance. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me. I should have asked to stop the car, but what bothered me was that when I looked at the woman, she seemed to be watching me. I didn't know how to explain it, but the feeling of being watched was uncontrollable. Then something very strange happened. I was looking at the street, and suddenly I saw a reflection in the rearview mirror. It was her, but it wasn't. Something about her face seemed distorted. I blinked, and the reflection in the mirror no longer looked human. It was as if something was trying to hide behind the form of a woman. I shrank back in my seat, my skin crawling. And that was when the woman finally moved. She looked at me straight into my eyes, and her gaze was cold, empty, as if it wasn't her, but something that was disguising itself. The driver kept driving, as if everything was normal. I wanted to scream, but something inside me told me not to. Suddenly, an unbearable headache took over me. I began to feel as if something was pulling my mind to a very distant place. I wanted to ask what was happening, but my throat was closed. I couldn't speak. I only felt a growing fear. The journey seemed endless. I looked out the window and saw that the streets were getting darker and more isolated. The city was disappearing. What was happening? I was starting to get desperate. I looked at the app screen on my phone and saw that the route was completely wrong. The route didn't make sense. The woman continued to watch me in the rearview mirror, her eyes now sharper, more penetrating. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" I finally managed to ask the driver. He didn't answer. He just pressed the accelerator. I was starting to understand that something wasn't right. And that's when the city lights disappeared completely. I could see darkness outside the window and heard the sounds of the car on the empty road. There was no life left. I was stuck with a strange woman and a driver who seemed to be in a trance. That woman, who I still didn't understand what she was, began to move slowly. She wasn't just watching anymore. She got up from the back seat and came towards me. I could smell something putrid, something old, something that wasn't human. The driver seemed oblivious, as if in a trance, driving non-stop. She pulled up beside me, looked straight at me and whispered, "You're going to help me, aren't you?" I couldn't answer. I was paralyzed with fear. She put her hand on my shoulder, and in that instant I felt like I was being pulled into a dark, endless place. A cold sensation washed over me. "You're going to help me get out of here. You're going to take me home, aren't you?" I was about to scream, but before I could do anything, she disappeared. The car stopped abruptly. I turned to the driver, but he was empty, as if he had never been there. The woman was gone. I looked around, and everything was silent, deserted. I was in a neighborhood I had never seen before, completely far from any familiar part of the city. That's when I checked the app again. The driver was no longer registered, and the ride hadn't ended. I woke up in my bed, not knowing how I had gotten home. Everything seemed normal, but something was wrong. When I looked at my Uber history, I saw that the ride was still there, and the driver's name was erased. I never used Uber at night again. And whenever I saw another passenger in the car, I cancelled the trip right away. If you're enjoying the stories, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and share it with your friends. Many more chilling stories are to come. My name is Antonio, and I live in Rio de Janeiro, and despite the difficulties this city has, I like living here. But there was something that happened to me that I can't explain, and since then, I avoid taking the train at night. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or anything like that, but after what I've been through, I can assure you that the inexplicable is real. It all started on a random night after another day of work. It was late, I was exhausted, and I just wanted to get home and rest. I was in downtown Rio, near the Central do Brasil station, and the plan was simple. Take the train to my house in Santa Cruz and sleep. The trip shouldn't be long. The train was empty when I got on, just a few people, which seemed like a good thing, since I was tired and wanted some silence. I sat by the window and put on my headphones, trying to relax while the driver continued on his way. The trip was very peaceful. The train passed through a few stations, and at each stop a few people got on and off. But it was at the third station, when the train became emptier, that things began to change. At the third station, the train door opened and a woman got on. She was alone. She was wearing a black outfit, a long dress, and had a blank expression on her face, as if she wasn't there. What bothered me the most was how calm she was. She didn't look at anyone, didn't greet anyone, just sat down in one of the back seats. The driver continued driving as if it were a normal journey, but I began to feel something strange in the air. It was as if the temperature inside the train had dropped a few degrees, and the silence, already uncomfortable, seemed heavier. I glanced at her, and for a moment our eyes met. I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were empty, without any emotion. I quickly looked away and tried to go back to the window, but something made me want to look more. At the next station, she got up and went to the door, but didn't get off. She stood there, as if she was waiting for something, looking outside without making any movement. That's when the train started moving slower, without explanation. The train passed Realengo station, and when I looked at the direction panel, I noticed something very strange. The driver had deviated from the route. It was impossible for him to be going that way. The train was taking a detour that was not part of the normal route, and the strangest thing is that there are no detours or other routes. How was that possible? The train only runs where there are tracks. That was impossible. I looked at the woman in black, but she was no longer on the bench. I tried not to panic, but I began to feel a sense of claustrophobia. I was trapped on a train that was not going where I expected. The driver, motionless, made no gesture, and the vehicle continued on without any concern for the direction. The train was now in an area of the city I had never seen before, a sort of abandoned industrial zone. It was not a busy place and the streets were deserted. I couldn't understand how the driver was so calm, driving through those empty streets. I thought about asking to stop and get out, but the feeling that something was wrong stopped me. I didn't know if I was afraid of the woman in black or of the direction the subway was taking. With each new station the train passed, I noticed something more disturbing. No one was waiting on the platform. The stops seemed completely deserted, without any movement. I didn't know if it was very late or if this was normal, but the lack of life in the stations made me more uneasy. That was when the driver made the next stop. The train stopped suddenly, and he stared out the window for a few seconds without saying a word. I didn't understand what he was seeing, but his gaze was distant, as if he was lost in thought. I got up and looked out the window, trying to see if there was any sign of life outside. But I saw no one, just dark buildings and streets without lights. What caught my attention the most was that in one of these buildings I saw something moving on the upper floor, a shadow sliding quickly from one side to the other. Something was not right. When the driver started up again, I could see in the reflection of the glass the face of the woman in black, who was now standing right behind me. Her eyes were fixed on me, and I could feel the pressure of her gaze, as if she were inside my head, watching me with evil intent. I didn't know what to do anymore. The driver, as if in a trance, drove aimlessly. I didn't know where he was going, and more importantly, I didn't know what was happening with that train. That's when something even stranger happened. The train doors suddenly closed without any command. The vehicle began to move faster, gone as if it was spinning out of control for no reason at all. I tried to press the emergency button, but it wouldn't work. Everything was out of control, and I was trapped. The woman in black was next to me now, but she no longer looked human. She was transforming, her skin disfiguring, turning dark and covered in a layer of a viscous substance. I couldn't look at her for long without feeling nauseous. Fear took over me, and that's when I realized that the train was heading towards a tunnel. The tunnel was dark, and the feeling of claustrophobia was so great that I thought I was going to die right there, at that moment. But the train never entered the tunnel. It stopped abruptly and everything went completely silent. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer on the train. I was at the Central do Brasil station, as if nothing had happened. The train, the driver, the woman in black, everything had disappeared. I was back at the point where I should have gotten off. The feeling of having come out of a nightmare gave me a momentary relief, but something inside me was still agitated. I wasn't crazy. To this day, I don't know what happened on that train. I tried to rationalize everything, but the fear was still with me. Something was wrong. Something about that train didn't make sense. Today, every time I take the train, I try to ignore what happened. I try to move on, but I can't stop looking at the stations and feeling that something is wrong. Sometimes I have the feeling that the woman in black is still there, watching. I know it sounds crazy, but there's something that tells me that it wasn't just a nightmare. It wasn't just my imagination. The train, those empty streets, the driver in a trance, it was all real. And no matter how hard I try to forget, I can't. So, if you ever find yourself on a train at night, be careful. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't the first time I'd taken the 11:45 p.m. bus, but that night the silence seemed even denser. I was returning from work, exhausted, with my head full of problems and a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. The city of Barreiro, in Belo Horizonte, was quiet at night, but the terminal where I waited for the bus always seemed to harbor a strange energy. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The bus arrived with a heavy roar, and the lights flashed as usual. The driver, an older man, had a vacant and distant look. When I got on, I felt a chill run down my spine. The vehicle was more crowded than usual for that time, but the silence of the passengers was disconcerting. Everyone was still, their faces partially hidden by the darkness. I sat in the back next to a window. It was then that I noticed something unusual. There was no sound of conversation, laughter, or music. Only the engine rumbled like a distant drumbeat. As the bus continued on its way, I began to notice the details that bothered me. The passengers seemed strangely detached, as if in a trance. There was an elderly woman holding a plastic bag filled with something that looked like liquid. She stared at the ground, unblinking. A man in a suit appeared to have fallen asleep, but his face was turned toward me at an uncomfortably rigid angle. I glanced out the window to try to shake off the feeling of unease, but the landscape outside was also strange. The streets seemed too dark. The streetlights flickered or didn't work. The shops, usually closed, had their windows broken, as if they had been abandoned for years. I knew this route, but nothing seemed familiar that night. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue, but then I heard the sound. A low, steady noise, like someone whispering my name. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but the sound persisted, coming from somewhere inside the bus. I decided to stand up to take a closer look at the other passengers, but something made me hesitate. A tall man in a trench coat was standing in the aisle, his back to me. I hadn't seen him before, but there he was, motionless, blocking my view of the front of the vehicle. "Excuse me," I whispered, but he didn't respond. When I tried to get closer, he slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were dull, almost grey, and his face looked blurry, like a poorly developed photograph. I took a step back, my heart racing. When I blinked, he was gone. I looked around at the other passengers, but no one seemed to have noticed. The old woman was still staring at the ground. The man in the suit was still motionless. My breath came in short pants, and a cold sweat was running down my face. I approached the driver, trying to find some explanation. He seemed oblivious to everything, his eyes fixed on the road. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, but he didn't answer. When I put my hand on his shoulder, he finally turned to me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse and emotionless. Before I could react, he jerked the steering wheel and the bus veered off the main road onto a street I had never seen before. The lights inside the bus began to flicker more brightly, and a strong smell of burning filled my nostrils. The passengers still didn't react, but their faces seemed paler, almost translucent. The new road seemed to go on forever, with dark, twisted trees lining both sides. I tried to open the window, but it wouldn't budge. My phone had no signal, and I began to yell at the driver, demanding that he stop. It was then that I noticed something terrible. His hands were covered in dark marks, like burns. "You've been here before," he muttered almost to himself. "We've all been." I didn't understand what he meant, but then I realized that the passengers had begun to move. It wasn't normal movement. Their bodies were contorting in unnatural ways, as if they were being manipulated by invisible strings. When the bus finally stopped, we were in a place that looked like a ghost town. The houses were ruins, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The driver opened the doors, and one by one the passengers began to get out, still in silence. "You have to get out too," the driver said, but I refused. Something told me that if I got out, I would never come back. "There is no choice," he added, with a look of pity. When I tried to run to the back door, it was locked. All the passengers were now outside, staring at me with those dull, empty eyes. I don't know how I managed to escape. I remember running through dark streets, hearing footsteps behind me, until I passed out. I woke up in a hospital with no explanation of how I had gotten there. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious for I walked along a disused highway, but there was no sign of a bus or other people. When I asked about Vale Serena, the town where the bus stopped, they said the town never existed. Now I avoid buses at all costs. I can't get on one without feeling a chill down my spine. Sometimes I hear the sound of an engine in the distance and wonder, did anyone else get on that bus and never get back?